The rejection was clean, precise, the kind of dismissal that only lands with full weight when it comes from someone who has earned the right to deliver it. Miles Davis had earned that right across 5 decades of music that had repeatedly dismantled whatever was comfortable and replaced it with something that nobody had heard before. He had been dismissed himself early on by the traditionalists who thought bebop was an aberration, by the critics who couldn't follow the turn toward electric, by the audiences who had loved Kinda Blue and felt personally abandoned when he refused to stay inside it. He had survived all of that by moving forward, by listening, by trusting his ear above every other instrument of measurement available to him. His ear was not a casual instrument. It had been trained in the specific way that only decades of obsessive attention can train something. Not just to hear what was there, but to hear what was missing, what was being avoided. What a musician reached for when they thought no one was paying close attention. Miles could hear the difference between a player who had practiced something and a player who understood it. He could hear the difference between technical control and genuine feeling. He could hear the layer of self-consciousness that most listeners never noticed because it was so constant in most music that it registered as silence rather than sound. That ear had built everything he had made. Every reinvention, every departure, every record that confused and eventually converted its critics, all of it had started with his ear telling him that something wasn't sufficient, that more was available, that the music around him had stopped asking the right questions. So when Miles spoke about music, people understood that the opinion was not casual. It had been filtered through something real. In the spring of 1991, a journalist asked him about Kurt Cobain. Miles didn't take long. "He can make noise," he said. "A lot of people can make noise. What I haven't heard is feeling, real feeling, the kind that costs you something. You can't fake that, and you can't find it by turning the volume up." The journalist wrote it down. The quote ran, and then, in the way of these things, it settled into the record. One more data point in the long history of one generation, refusing to hear what the next one was saying. The jazz patriarch dismissing the grunge kid. Predictable, filed and forgotten. Nobody expected it to change. The brownstone on West 77th Street held the particular silence of a working space between projects. Miles had always needed that silence. Not as rest, but as preparation, a clearing of the sonic field so that new ideas had somewhere to arrive. In the months after that interview, he was finishing Doo-Bop, his final album, a record that was making his label anxious in ways he found privately satisfying. He was also painting, as he had been for years, filling canvases with color in the same way he filled music with space. Not decoratively, but with intention. Every mark a decision about what to leave and what to remove. He was 65 years old. The body had become a negotiation. The pain was managed, not absent. But the listening had not changed. The listening never changed. His assistant had a habit of leaving the radio on in the mornings while preparing the house. Miles rarely commented on what played. Music in the background was still music, and his ear processed it the way other people's ears process conversation. Automatically, involuntarily, extracting information without requiring conscious attention. One morning in early autumn, something made him stop. He was standing in the hallway between the kitchen and the studio. He had been moving with purpose towards something, a thought or a cup of coffee or a canvas. He wouldn't have been able to say which afterward. But something coming from the radio in the kitchen stopped his feet on the floor and held them there. He stood very still. The song was distorted, loud in the particular way he had described to the journalist, the kind of loud that seemed designed to substitute for something rather than express it. But underneath the distortion, there was a voice. And underneath the voice, there was something that the voice was sitting on, something that didn't announce itself, something that the production and the volume were almost obscuring, except that it was strong enough to come through anyway, the way certain signals come through interference if they're transmitting with enough power. He stood in the hallway until the song ended. He didn't ask what it was immediately. He went into the kitchen, poured his coffee, sat down at the table, and let the silence after the song settle for a moment, the way he always let silences settle. Not filling them, but listening to what they contained. Then he asked, His assistant named the song, named the band. Miles nodded once, picked up his coffee and said nothing further. But his assistant noticed that he sat there longer than usual before moving. Longer than the coffee required. Longer than the morning required. He was listening to something that had already stopped playing. Gordon Meltzer had managed Miles for 10 years. In that time, he had learned to treat unusual requests from Miles as significant without asking why they were significant. Miles didn't explain himself. He moved, and Gordon's job was to facilitate the movement, not interrogate it. The request came 3 days after that morning in the hallway. Miles called in the early afternoon, an ordinary hour for Miles, who kept hours that suited him rather than convention, and said he needed a tape. Not a finished record, a rehearsal recording. Something that hadn't been cleaned up yet. Of what? Gordon said. Nirvana, Miles said. Gordon was quiet for a moment. He had read the interview from the spring. He remembered the quote precisely. I'll find something, he said. He made calls. It took 4 days. Someone in the music industry periphery knew someone who had access to session recordings from earlier that year. Informal documentation of rehearsals, recorded on basic equipment, never intended for release. A cassette arrived at the brownstone by courier. Miles signed for it himself. Gordon didn't hear from him for 5 days. When the call came, it was early, 7 in the morning. Gordon was still at home, not yet at his office, and the phone ringing at that hour from Miles's number produced a specific kind of alertness. The kind that understands something has shifted before the voice on the other end says a word. You listened to it, Miles said. Again, not a question. No, Gordon said. I sent it straight over. A pause that lasted long enough to become something. He doesn't perform, Miles said finally. Gordon waited. Most musicians, even the good ones, even the ones who know what they're doing, they perform. You can hear it. There's a layer between them and the sound, a layer of awareness, of self-consciousness. They know they're being recorded, or they know someone is listening, or they're trying to prove something, and that knowing gets into the music. It changes what they reach for. He stopped. Gordon could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. This kid doesn't have that layer, Miles said. On that tape, which is rough, which is unfinished, which is the kind of thing that's not supposed to reveal anything because there's nothing at stake. He plays like he's alone, like the guitar is just an extension of whatever is happening inside him, and nobody has told him yet that it's supposed to be separate from that. Another pause. I said he couldn't feel, Miles said. I was wrong about that. It was the closest thing to a retraction that Gordon had ever heard from Miles Davis in 10 years. He understood the weight of it. He didn't say anything that would make Miles feel observed in that moment. What do you want me to do with this? Gordon asked. Nothing, Miles said. I just needed to say it to somebody. He hung up. Miles Davis died on September 28, 1991. Nevermind had been released 4 days before his death. He did not hear what that record became. He did not watch it displace Michael Jackson from the top of the charts, did not see the magazine covers or the television performances, did not observe the way it restructured the commercial landscape of American music in a matter of weeks. He did not see what the weight of that success did to the person who had made it. The slow erosion, the growing impossibility of being that visible while being that private, the particular damage that comes from the world deciding it owns you before you've decided who you are. He heard a rehearsal cassette in a brownstone in Manhattan. He made a private call to his manager at 7 in the morning. He said what he needed to say, and then he was gone. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994. Between those two deaths, 31 months. Neither man spoke the other's name in any recorded context. They had existed briefly in the same cultural moment. One at the end of a 50-year career, one at the beginning of something that would last only 3 more years. And they had never shared a room. Never had the conversation that might have clarified what each of them understood about the thing beneath the music. Never discovered what they had in common underneath everything that separated them. That absence is part of the story. Maybe the largest part. There is something in the timing that resists being made comfortable. Miles formed his public opinion in the spring. He heard the tape in the autumn. He died 4 days after the record that tape became was released to the world. He never knew what Nevermind became. He only knew what he heard on the cassette. raw, unfinished, unperformed, and what that rawness told him about the person behind it. It told him he had been wrong. He said so once at 7 in the morning to one person. Then the world moved on without either of them in it. Gordon carried the phone call quietly, not out of obligation or secrecy, but because the moment felt too specific for public consumption, too rooted in a particular hour and a particular tone of voice to survive being translated into something portable and repeatable. Miles had said he needed to tell somebody. Gordon was the somebody. That felt like the natural boundary of the thing. He had also considered in the years afterward what it would mean to say it out loud. Miles Davis admitting he was wrong, not in a technical sense, not about a chord change or a tempo, but about a person, about the presence or absence of something real in another musician's playing. That kind of admission from Miles was rare enough that it would attract attention, and attention would attract skepticism, and skepticism would require defense. And Gordon had no interest in defending a private phone call against people who had not been on either end of it. So he said nothing publicly. For 6 years. Then in 1997, a jazz publication approached him about a retrospective on Miles's final recordings. The focus was doo-bop, the hip-hop fusion record that had bewildered and fascinated people in equal measure. The last statement from a man who had spent 50 years refusing to stand still. Gordon agreed to speak. The interview was long. Most of it covered what you would expect. The recording sessions, the collaborators, the label's anxieties, Miles's certainty. Near the end, almost as an aside, Gordon mentioned the tape. 3 paragraphs. No emphasis. No pull quote. The kind of placement that tells you the editor considered it a footnote rather than a headline. It was read by almost no one at the time. It resurfaced years later in the early internet, passed between people in the specific corners where jazz listeners and rock listeners occasionally found each other. A thread here, a message board post there. People who had grown up with both artists and understood, without needing it explained, what it meant that Miles Davis had listened to a Nirvana rehearsal tape in the last months of his life and called his manager before dawn to say he had been wrong. Most of the people who read it said nothing publicly. They just held it. Some things don't need to be argued. They just need to be known. There is a version of music history that is organized by genre, by era, by the clean divisions that make cataloging possible. In that version, Miles Davis and Kurt Cobain belong to entirely separate chapters. The jazz visionary and the grunge icon, separated by generation and tradition and every measurable marker of taste. They do not appear in the same sentence except as contrast, but there is another version, less organized, less comfortable, that pays attention to what musicians actually hear when they listen carefully. That version is full of these crossings, moments when someone trained to hear in one way encounters something from a completely different direction and recognizes, beneath all the surface differences, the thing that was always the thing. The quality that precedes genre. The thing that exists in the musician before the music does. Miles had chased that quality his entire life. He had heard it in Charlie Parker and called it genius. He had heard it in John Coltrane and called it something closer to prayer. He had heard traces of it in Bill Evans, in the specific way Evans approached silence as if it were as important as the notes surrounding it. He had organized his entire career around the pursuit of musicians who possessed it, finding them, recording with them, then moving on when the music between them had said what it needed to say. He had heard a trace of it on a rough rehearsal cassette from a 23-year-old in Seattle and called it real. He had said so once to one person at 7 in the morning in the last months of his life. Gordon Meltzer set it down in 3 paragraphs in a jazz magazine in 1997. Some confessions move slowly. Some take years to find the people they were meant for. This one traveled the distance. He plays like he's alone. I said he couldn't feel. I was wrong about that. Miles Davis to Gordon Meltzer, September 1991.